good question. I would say depending on the size of the company and who does what is, don't always get caught up in the numbers, right? You got to get yourself out of the day-to-day numbers and look bigger picture. Get with the person that's the visionary if it's not you, and have a goal, right? For those that aren't doing annual budgets or planning meetings, I don't know where they fall on your list, Dan, but I couldn't imagine not doing that annually. That really sets the momentum going into the next, year, 3 years, 5 years, whatever you're focused on.
Welcome to Peer Talk, a dialogue with business owners just like you. Peer Talk conversations run the gamut of business challenges facing owners today. The host of Peer Talk is Dan Crowley, founder and owner of Peer Executive Groups, which provides a safe space for owners to share their experience, grow their businesses, and learn from their peers.
Hi, this is Dan Crowley. We have a number of great owners in our peer group network, just like you, and our job is to give you a voice here on Peer Talk.
Today's Peer Talk podcast is sponsored by Integrasoft, business software for your growing company. Integrasoft's suite of software scales to meet and exceed your business needs. Their variety of solution packs will ensure that their ERP program can fit and grow within your company. Schedule a demo today.
Today's edition of Peer Talk is a special one. We are used to presenting and doing press releases for our Top Gun winners each year. Today we're going to speak with two of our top 25, and they reside in our top 10, so it's going to be exciting. First, we will have Chris Jarrett from Time Rentals up in Missoula, Montana, as well as Mike Weaver, who is the controller for Vandalia Rental in Vandalia, Ohio. Welcome. Well, welcome to another edition of Peer Talk. I'm very excited. This is our Top Gun edition. I don't think we did this last year, and we need to do it every year. So we're going to be talking specifically about submitting financials in the peer groups and, essentially assessing performance. And so we have two experts with us today. Number one is Mike Weaver, who is from one of our top 10 operators in Top Gun, and he is right now the finance director at Vandalia Rental. Mike, how long have you been there?
Coming up on 9 years this July.
Excellent. So when the peer groups visit Vandalia, which they do quite often, they usually get to stop by Mike's office, and he's got fun stuff going on in there. So we say hello to him. And our other guest in this session is Chris Jarrett, who is the supreme leader of Time Rental in Missoula, Montana. Welcome, Chris.
Thank you.
Also representing one of the top 10 operators this past year. So congrats on that. One of the things that's nice about this particular episode is, as I stated in the earlier part, I believe that we have number 4, 5, 6, and 7 on this podcast, which is, giving it up early, giving you some count and let people know, make sure you show up at our event when we do the countdown, but at least, 4 out of our top 10 there. So appreciate you guys taking the time today to speak with me. So let's start off with a little bit more about performance. The last group that came in, and we were talking earlier in the podcast about the rules of the road, what we look at. There are a couple rules that we will discuss later on, which have to do with the owner's compensation and expense, and also the rent if there needs to be an adjustment. So there's a bit of governance that happens as people submit financials, and that allows us to go through some good, strong auditing and identifying the leaders in terms of performance. But that being said, there's other things happening in the business, and we're going to start big and get small. So let's start with Mike. So Mike, I think you and I have had conversations about this. How does one determine, or let's specifically focus on you, how do you determine what a cost of rental is? Like, what is that? Like, you think in terms of, like, is there labor in there? Is there what all goes into the cost of rental? And I threw, there's a couple of potholes in that question, so we'll see if you uncover those potholes first.
Cost of rental for us is, I don't know if we're unique in this, but I look at everything that's pretty much not depreciation, interest, pretty much anything down to the EBITDA line from our financials is that we kind of consider cost of rental or operational costs. So we strictly look at the EBITDA line mostly first before we drop down and start looking at, depreciation, interest, and amortization. So I don't know if that's unique to other companies, but that really is our focus because we are focused on rental. We don't do a lot of equipment sales, new equipment sales, I should say. We look at it both with and without used equipment to kind of see just from a pure operational standpoint how things are going. Used equipment, for example, can really skew the results. If you sell a lot in either 1 month or 1 quarter, or even 1 year compared to another, it could really kind of make your overall results look a little different. So we tend to, or at least I tend to back that out and just kind of look at what I call operational revenue and expenses.
Perfect. That's perfect. Yeah, and that's really what I wanted to get to in this episode, was to make sure everybody understood that, you know, you could go a lot of different ways with rental cost, right? One of the things that we try to focus on, and the previous guests that we just had on, we talked about what level do you expense your rental assets at, right? So if you're expensing rental assets above 7,500, well, guess what? You're going to have a lot of rental costs when you refresh your inventory, right? When you're buying small tools and things like that, those all become costs. Your EBITDA is going to be small. A lot of people I have spoken with this spring had low EBITDAs and they're crying. And I'm like, well, you understand that you're expensing things at a high level. Most, I would say, accountant focused operations are expensing at the $1,500 level, right? That expense everything, and part of the reason they do that is simply because they don't care about the tax consequence. They're going to leave that for their tax accountant. They're going to focus on, well, what is the cost of rental, right? So they'll look at that. So a couple things we did do this past year with the Top Gun, we threw out used equipment sales, the net amount that used to factor into the rental cost. We got rid of it and we put it down below the line. We took interest and depreciation related to rental assets, and we took those out of the cost equation and put them down below the rental line. Now, a lot of people will say, that's not right. Let's talk about that. But really, for us to look at things, even Steven, we wanted it to be decided by performance, not by accounting decisions, right? So that allows us to kind of really look at the list, and so you see a lot of different operators on the list just this year, like Mr. Chris Jarrett. Welcome, Chris, to the program. And so my question for you, Chris, is, we get, so when you expense a rental asset, it's a cost of rental, correct?
Correct. Yep.
Yeah, so it's going to be a cost. And so if you're expensing under a certain amount, like anything over a certain amount would be capitalized. So, taking that and putting that out onto the balance sheet, it keeps a clean look at performance. In your case, let's talk about the biggest item not related to rental costs. So what's the second largest cost to time rental? Probably payroll, right? Yeah, people. So, and you're going to have your payroll costs plus all your other labor costs as well. Venture to guess, this is just a guess on your part, any ideas as to what your labor costs as a percentage of sales was for 23? I know I'm going back a year, but any ideas, or do you know what yours is currently? What your labor costs as a percentage of sales?
No, I do not. I'd have to look at
So we talked a little bit about this being in the range of pretty high. So when you look at overall personnel costs, the peer group averages 31 and the median's 30. But then when you focus on the top quartile, which is Top Gun, the average is 26 and the median's 26. So 26 would be a good goal for someone trying to be Top Gun. The Top Gun guys, in addition to making up percent there on the payroll portion, their rental, the gross margin on rental was much higher by, a matter of 6 or 7%. So it made a difference. At the end of the day, the results were the EBITDA for Top Gun medians. The middle person in our Top Gun 25 was at 39% EBITDA, right? And you guys, of course, made it into top 10 of the 25. So good for you. Now, just to give it perspective for the whole network, there were 100 submissions, and the middle person came in at a 25% EBITDA, which was significantly lower than what we had seen in the past. And that's mainly due to the cost of personnel. And it could be also related to the fact that people pushed up from expensing around 1,500 to 2,500 to now we average closer to 3,250, which means a lot more people are expensing below 5,000, which is going to affect that EBITDA number. So comfortable with our rankings. And the change of EBITDA, the downgrading of EBITDA, but it's mainly due to accounting practice, right? So we can leave it there. So in your case, give us a little detail about your operation. You're one of the smaller operators who achieved Top Gun status. Tell us about the structure of your overhead, your people.
Yeah, I mean, I like to run lean. Kind of lean and mean. That's our goal here. We all wear a lot of hats, even including myself, in a smaller operation, smaller market. So it doesn't surprise me that we're quite a bit lower than even the median in that aspect. We have multiple people who can drive, multiple people who can. No one's afraid to wash and grease here. So. And then we use I use some fractional services around, like HR and bookkeeping at this point, so that we're not having a lot of in-house payroll in that sense. So some of that, like I said, there's always variations there, right? Where the number is not always the true number, because I've got services that are probably in a different bucket somewhere. But yeah, fractional services, and then really just kind of all boils up to lean and mean, which I learned that from previous experiences before I was here of doing that. So
interesting. So I'm gonna go back and forth with you guys, because this is gonna be really fun. So Vandalia, one of the larger members in the peer groups, right? So what is your head count right now? Would you say, Mike?
I think we're out around 150 as far as head count.
150.
Yeah.
That's quite a few people focused on rental, right?
Yep. Yeah, it's been growing pretty rapidly over the last few years.
So how do you see your operation? Clearly, you guys are doing well on labor force management. What are some of the things that you think have worked well for you in the past?
Yeah, I think one of the things that's benefiting us the most now is just scaling, right? So we've been able to grow. We've been able to grow from 1 location to 8, and we'll continue to grow, and that allows us to scale. So while Chris says he's kind of running lean, I don't want to say we're running fat per se, but with growth, we are really investing in our labor to continue to push this growth forward. So we're investing in labor as far as IT. We do have to keep the back office filled to keep billings and AR and AP going, and we're now rolling out the company into districts. So with that comes managers within the districts, right? So now you have more and more layers, and we're doing that purposely, because now as we continue to grow, we won't have to add those all the time. Those districts will grow, and then we'll continue to scale. So it's kind of like invest in people, scale, invest in people, scale, and keep growing, and that's our mission. So if we weren't in this growth phase, we would, we could run much leaner if we were looking to sell or trying to make the financials look a certain way, in order to prop things up even better. But we're doing the opposite. I'm not going to say fact. We do a lot of the same things Chris mentioned, a lot of crossover still skill set, but we're really priming ourselves to be ready for continued growth and the next phase of growth, whatever that means, to Vandalia.
Very, very cool. Very cool. The one of the things that I was going to mention I don't know if you both do EOS. Do you both do EOS implementation? Yeah.
We
Okay.
do EOS. We do EOS. We're not following it,
Exact. Yeah.
we flex from it some, but we have implemented that and
And
use some of those tools.
The reason why I brought that up was you both are leading the way when it comes to employee metrics. So when I look at the amount of rental revenue or revenue being generated, and compare it to your payroll hours that are worked and or that are paid out, like paid out in full, which includes holiday pay or paid time off, you're doing well. And then when I cross-reference that with labor costs as a percentage of, like, my favorite is labor costs as a percentage of gross profit. But you guys both score well. If you look at your columns, you're in green, which we do conditional formatting in peer groups. So you want to see green when you're looking at your summary sheets. So do you guys look at that monthly or quarterly or just annually? Like, what employee metrics do you look at, and do you look at how frequently do you look at them?
Go ahead, Mike.
We don't really look at metrics. Like, there are metrics we look at, right? But they're very kind of higher level metrics, and not so much just labor to rental, because we know we're in this investment, what I call the investment phase, and it's been that way. But we're looking more at revenue growth. We're looking at financial utilization or dollar utilization, it's called a lot of times, in the market. We're looking at our balance sheet, how much, we're cash focused, how much cash are we creating? What's the debt levels that we're taking on compared to our EBITDA, right? So there's a lot of different metrics, but I don't, it's not like I'm sitting there and just looking at all these metrics day in and day out. We're focused on strategy, moving the company ahead. And while you have to keep a pulse on some of that stuff, even I, as an accountant, right, background in accounting, would go crazy if I had to look at just metrics all day long. So it's important, but not one that, we have a handle on overall at a global level enough to make decisions, and we know where we are, right? We look at the right things, but I don't have a list of 35 metrics that I'm sitting there and, oh gosh, there's a yellow one. We don't, at least at this point, we don't have to do that.
So I have to throw you guys a bone, because I've worked with both of you, and when you mention what you just did, it does make me think you've got a point on the horizon. So would you attribute kind of some of this related to the fact that Kurt Barney would identify a vision for where you guys are headed, and then you go to that vision as a group? Okay.
Yes, 100%.
That makes sense.
Kurt is definitely a visionary. I would typically not be a visionary, but once you paint that picture for me, like that's why Kurt and I make such a good team. He kind of lays it out, and then I'm good at helping to implement that. Whereas he's not the good at implementing it. He's look at that bright, squirrel over, he'll go off to the next thing, if we allowed him to. So it's the leadership team we have in place helps march towards those, orders type of thing, vision.
Yeah.
And we have long-term goals, and we've continued to hit them, and we have another one for, by 2027, and I expect us to hit it. Right. So that's
excellent.
He's tip of the spear.
Excellent. Yeah. And I would, pivoting over to Chris, I've known Chris a couple of years now, Chris, and you, one of the things that was most shocking to me, which, obviously you've got Tanner there, you've got other key employees that you're working with, but you guys actually do annual planning, right? Yeah. Which is everybody, it sounds normal. Oh, everybody does annual planning, don't they? Well, they don't. I can tell you that in rental, people do not do annual planning. They look at the tea leaves, and if they see there's, if they hear everybody telling them there's going to be 8% growth this year, then they want 8% growth. But why don't you tell us a little bit about your process? What do you do for annual planning to get your mind straight for the new year and where you're headed?
Yeah, absolutely. And then I could tie it into a little bit of, mimicking what Mike was just going over there, because it all same thing. This was the first time I'd seen a percentage of labor, right? So it's not a metric that we were looking at, but it's great to know that it fell into place because with our annual planning for the past few years, it has all been revolved around assets, acquiring assets, and making sure that they were performing where they needed to perform. So, I mean, the cliche saying of sales trumps all, right? Sometimes you got to get lean and mean on that P&L, but right now it was meeting the demands, getting the right assets, and making sure that everything here was producing, right? Getting rid of dead assets, things of that nature. Which that's our annual planning was a lot of that. It was a lot of conditional formatting. You remember, Dan, of assets, what we thought for, what they did, what kind of return we were seeing, percentages. And if all of those assets were performing and we felt like we had the right amount of people in place, then that's kind of what produced this result here. So.
Yeah, it was fascinating for me, and I appreciate. Thank you very much for including me in your annual planning process the last couple of years, just to see what goes into the asset side of things, right? So I'm always focused on staffing and focusing on getting rental out the door, maybe keeping utilization high, but I'm not thinking in terms of growth of assets, right? Growth of inventory. And looking backwards through, and again, you're a point of rental user, you had the ability to kind of look back at some pieces and see how they were performed in the past and what you needed to get out of them. So that was kind of cool. All right, so let's pivot on the, we're going to stay on the income statement just for a little bit, a couple more seconds. So one of the big tests that we put into place for Top Gun as well as peer groups is we look at your occupancy. So occupancy is about 70 to 80%. That cost structure is built around rent. If you are renting from yourself or an affiliated operation, there is a tendency and or an advantage to either set a low rent or set a high rent. A lot of people like to set a high rent and pay off their parents, right? Or a lot of people would like to set a low rent because they can and take the compensation elsewhere. So we, in peer groups, we look at that number and we want it to fall. We want rent to fall somewhere between 4% and 8%. We want to see occupancy be at least 10% or below. Let me just quickly tell you what I'm seeing. So in Top Gun, we're seeing that the median is coming in around 7%, and that is less than the overall peer group network by 1% or 2%. So again, we're seeing a percent being 1% to 2% better in the Top Gun performing operators, but we also make a point to test Top Gun to make sure that the Top Gun operators are not taking advantage of that. Tell us a little bit about your who you pay rent to. So first off, let's go with Chris. Do you guys own your property or is it an affiliate owner?
Affiliate owner.
Okay. So it's someone you're related to. It could be you, your family as a separate entity. Do you make any choices around your rent because of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean,
Okay.
it's in a family dynamic, obviously that gets very complicated. And, like I said, you can either make one look good or one look bad. So we try to balance that. And like I said, with family, you have to be thinking multiple directions on that. So,
and when we help a member prepare for sale, we help to adjust the rent, not necessarily adjust the rent truly, but adjust it from how there's an adjusted EBITDA, right? So that we're going to look at. But it's important to have that. That's typically a non-financial fact. So anybody who's submitted for peer groups knows that we ask you to put in your P&L and your balance sheet. And then there's a whole bunch of other questions that are not related, that are non-financial related questions. And that would be one of them. So how about in Vandalia's case? Do you guys own all your properties or are you renting?
Yeah, so we're renting all of them. They're all affiliated with either, within the family, the Barney family, except for one. We do have one third-party lease. And outside of that, though, I believe for us, it's all pretty much market driven. I'm not sure where the percentage is based on your calculations, but it's done pretty officially and based on market is my understanding, which does give us some sense of control, if things were to go, if the economy was to pull back, right? I think what you were leaning into, Dan, is that then, if Kurt's in a good position or the family, we can maybe lower the rents to help the business, right? So there is some benefit to doing that. And luckily for us, it's just basically it's just one individual. It's Kurt mainly, and his dad might own a building, right? So with Kurt owning the majority of individual LLCs, it does provide that flexibility if ever needed. Thankfully, we haven't had needed to worry about that at this point.
Flexibility is a good too, but we also I like to think of it as whether you're positioning yourself to sell or not, it's always having your books clean, right? So having, like he mentioned, a market rate there, whether it's family or not, so that you don't have to, whenever you're explaining something, like I said, maybe, even if it's not selling in the next few years, if it's selling 20 years down the road, rent has a consistent with the market so that it's not something you're trying to explain on the back end of the sale or something of that nature.
Got it. Yeah, exactly. So perfect. So I'm looking at both of your guys in the columns right now in the lineup. And again, one of the reasons why you're top performers, right, is the managing of that. And I want to make sure that we calculated your property properly, and we did. So just good to verify, right, that we had the data right. Okay, so let's pivot for our last couple questions, and that is around health. This is where Chris Jarrett gets nervous because he thinks I'm going to ask him a lot of balance sheet questions, but I'm not going to do that. So many people who've sat through me going over the financials and has stayed awake to this point know that when we talk about balance sheet health, I have a hard time saying what is green and what is red, right? Because balance sheet is the health, which is your balance sheet, is really a philosophy. So let's just, in general, I'd love to hear your guys' philosophy on number one, debt. How do you feel about debt? Is it good? Is it bad? How do you use it? That kind of thing. And then number two, if you have anything uniquely challenging around liquidity. So two totally different things. One is your feelings about debt and what your debt level looks like, good, bad, how would you like to improve it, why? And then on the liquidity side, I have here data that shows how fast you're collecting, how slow it is to pay out. And ultimately, at the end of the day, it comes back to just cash flow, right? So how do you feel? So let's start with Mike on this one. Let's talk about debt and then tell us about liquidity.
Sure. So, debt, I guess I've had to kind of see it work and kind of change my opinion over the years on debt. So for us, debt's really been a good thing up to this point. So we've been able to grow our fleet, take on debt, initially at low interest rates, right? And then with the climbing rates, we were able to, I'm going to flip back and forth on you here a little bit, Dan, with some liquidity and holding that cash, we're able to then invest it, as interest rates rise, we're getting 5% at least on the money we have, which then offsets a lot of the interest that we're getting as the rates have now climbed up to 6-7%, right? It ends up for us being almost like cheap insurance, right? So we would rather keep some high levels of cash. With people really used to disagree with, I think, how much cash we're holding, and still might, but we're able to hold that cash to use for bigger and better things down the road, keep the debt, only pay an interest or 2 points, of cost, because the interest rate on the debt's maybe just a little higher than what we're getting on the cash. So debt for us has been great. Now, if there's a huge economic downturn, right, there's a little bit of risk there, but we do have the liquidity at this point to really help us be okay for some length of time. So I'm kind of crossing them both at the same time on you, but that's how we look at it.
It's fascinating to me because you are one of the few that have embraced the use of debt, some extreme levels of debt, but with the growth that backs it. Right. So what I found is like one of the things that frustrates me is when I see people pay down their debt and they're still growing. Right.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm like, let's look at your return on asset, your return on equity. It's a lot more than what your interest rate is on your debt. So why are you paying off that debt? It doesn't make sense.
Right.
Now, if you're not growing, it's a whole nother case, right? And the question becomes, like in the case of Chris, and we're going to segue over to Chris here, is Chris had to make a decision if he was going to slow down this year and if it was only going to be for 1 year. And so, right, so if you have this debt structure and you're like, well, we're going to have a momentary pause this year, but we're going to keep growing in 25 and 26, right? So with that, Chris, tell us about your debt and your liquidity feelings.
Yeah, very, very similar, actually. I mean, it's interesting, right? At two totally different levels. But, for us in the beginning, it was that organic growth, save the cash, use the cash. And then when we got comfortable with, like you said, your return on your investments, then we got more comfortable with debt. I think debt's healthy as long as, like you just explained, you're actively looking at those returns.
Right.
Behind. We're in a very similar situation, obviously on a much different scale, but we're comfortable with our cash reserves, comfortable with the level of debt. Maybe it's a naive statement, but for me, it's the cost of money, right? And the cost of money was right for the last few years, maybe not as much right now. It's reaching that level, right? Where it's not as cheap as it was. So that's where I think people are maybe, I don't want to say pulling back, but it's shifting the strategy a little bit, right?
So just to illustrate this, is it okay if I share a little bit about your performance? I'm not going to give dollars. I'm going to focus on percentages. Sure. So your return on asset, for every dollar of earnings that your company makes, it's making almost 25 cents, right? You got almost you have a 24.8% return on asset. Your return on equity is 47.7, which is,
Oh, did we lose Dan?
Was that just me or?
I think you did it, didn't you?
Yeah.
Look like as soon as you moved, he left. Let's see if he can rejoin or. Here he comes.
Oh my gosh. I can't believe that killed. All right. So we're still recording and we are on. So just so you know, we're recording and I'm going to just flip down here for this part of it.
You have to edit that.
Yeah. So real quick, Chris, one of the cool things about your operation is, and if you don't mind me sharing, some of your metrics are great when it comes to your balance sheet health. You got closer to 25% return on asset. You're closing in on 50% return on equity, which means every dollar I give you or every dollar of earnings that you generate, you're making these incredible returns. And you put that in the context of the cost of money, and you say, yeah, I'll take more debt. I'll take more loans because I'm performing like this. The other thing that was really interesting for me was you're collecting your money. You're very good, operationally, even though you don't have a bookkeeping team per se. So you're collecting very quickly. You're paying out. So you're collecting inside 10 days. You're paying out just inside 30 days. So it's allowing you to not necessarily be the bank for your vendors, right? Or your customers, right? So somehow you're able to train your construction-based customers to pay timely, which is it's a hard thing. If you're on the West Coast, by the way, and listening to this podcast, you'll know what I mean. They cannot get people to pay their bills, right? It just doesn't happen on the West Coast. So anyway, it's pretty crazy.
May I ask a question to Chris on that, Dan? Why is that, Chris? Are you guys really strict on collections, or you just have the base? Because to me, that could be a double-edged sword, right? Because we're actually more lenient on terms because we find that by being that way, that people end up paying, and we get more business that way because even some people that may not extend credit we're very liberal in that regard. Therefore, we work with people. We end up getting paid eventually on most, our write-offs are less than 1% of our revenue, but we will let things, draw out. So I guess it's, I can see it working both ways a little bit here.
No, that's a great point. I think at our size, it was important to be strict. And I think as we grow, you make a great point of probably, I think, being more lenient, but with clear communication, right? Like I have no problem. I tell this to our sales rep, like if there's going to be volume behind it, I'm willing for different terms, right? If they wanted to do 40 days or 60 days, and I knew I had the confidence that we were going to get paid, we're all for that. For us, I think I can pinpoint it. It was my very first ARA conference in Orlando, and one of the off-break meetings was about credit, and they just drilled into everybody there that credit is a privilege. And I took that very seriously. And even though a lot of these people that we were being strict with were way bigger contractors than we were a rental outfit, I still always treated credit as a privilege. And if I'm going to extend you terms, they should be met, and I think you learn about the people when, and the customers, if they can't meet those terms, then it becomes a problem. And in that same conference, that gentleman said people paid him a lot of money to come into their companies and fix that problem. So it became a big problem. And almost every time he says one of the customers that he suggests going legal with, everybody in that organization says, "Oh, but they're our best customer." He says, "Well, until they can't pay, and when they can't pay, that 200, 300, 400 grand that's past due, then they're not a good customer." So 100%. That's my viewpoint on it. I do think you make a great point that you do have to be lenient as it becomes more volume oriented. But in the past, I've a small team, so it's me and one other person who are handling those calls. And after 40 days, we start picking up the phone and making those gentle reminders.
Yeah.
It comes past that. So.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Guys, we've run out of time, but I appreciate you being able to make the podcast. I'm really looking forward to the awards and getting you guys some trophies in your hands. Mike, last chance to share. You got a room full of controllers and finance directors. Any words of wisdom?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would say depending on the size of the company and who does what is, don't always get caught up in the numbers, right? You got to get yourself out of the day-to-day numbers and look bigger picture. Get with the person that's the visionary if it's not you, and have a goal, right? For those that aren't doing annual budgets or planning meetings, I don't know where they fall on your list, Dan, but I couldn't imagine not doing that annually. So it's good to hear that Chris is doing that. It really sets the momentum going into the next, year, 3 years, 5 years, whatever you're focused on.
Excellent. No, good words. How about you, Chris? Any last minute words?
Yeah, same thing. I feel like I do kind of fit that visionary role here, right? But at the same time, I make sure that we do look at those metrics, and I don't go beyond the P&L, but I look at P&Ls almost weekly, and making sure that things are where they're at. But I am that squirrel. If you ask Tanner, I'm the one that's bouncing all around.
Awesome.
A few of them take traction. So
I will also comment, not to promote peer groups, but you both are an excellent financially intellect peer groups. So you've got a number of owners and operators in your peer groups that think big with great vision, and they chase after a point on the horizon, but they also understand financial controls and the importance of systems. So I hope you both appreciate that about your companies. It's always impressive from the outside looking in. So appreciate it, and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Dan.
Thanks, Dan. See you, Chris.
You've been listening to Peer Talk from Peer Executive Groups, produced and directed by Noah Crowley and hosted by Dan Crowley. Subscribe to this podcast for notifications of future episodes of Peer Talk.